And we're live.
Okay, go then?
Yep.
All right, this is where we left off yesterday. We've gone over the similarities between male and female victims of domestic violence. And, you know, I think I mentioned yesterday it should be called battered spouse syndrome because it doesn't really matter what gender is. There are a lot of similarities. But here are some of the differences. Often men are not believed when they report domestic violence. I mentioned yesterday that typically the police will arrest the male regardless of any kind of evidence to the contrary. He can be bleeding and clearly injured, and they will arrest him, and they justify it by saying, well, she was defending herself. Well, that might be true, but it's not always true, but they always go to that. Men feel diminished as men. I mean, the whole social gender construct, as I've talked about yesterday, was that men are always supposed to be tough, in control, in charge, head of the house, all that kind of stuff. So when a man has been victimized, particularly physically battered by his wife, he feels that he's diminished as a male. And often that's the kind of feedback he gets. Well, what's your problem? Can't you control your woman? So again, that idea that he's inferior as a male is reinforced by people around him that don't really understand the possibility. Not supported by police. I mentioned that we have rarely had a male victim of domestic violence supported by the police. In fact, I can't even think of any case where they have assumed that the woman was actually the perpetrator of the violence and where she was arrested. If anything at all, they might support the idea of a restraining order, but that's really more about keeping them separate. It's not that they actually view the woman as being more responsible for the violence. Men are less likely to report, and that's understandable because, first of all, they don't think that it happens often. So if they're reporting, they think that they're one of a million guys that have actually been victims of domestic violence. And so they're not going to come forward because they think it's a rare occurrence, and they probably are aware that the police tend not to support it. And I think that this kind of misconception might even be supported by some TV programs. If you see a CSI program or something like that in which there's domestic violence going on, you'll probably see that in the storyline, the men are not believed, they are arrested instead of the woman. So again, that's another contributing factor to why a man is not going to report his victimization from domestic violence. Abuse is not recognized socially, legally. It's just like people don't think it happens. And of course, the biggest issue is the last one on the list, limited resources. There's only, I think, 4, maybe 5 maximum programs for male survivors of sexual abuse in the country. And ours is probably the only one that also works with men that are domestic violence. So if you are a man who's a victim of domestic violence anywhere in Canada, it's a long commute to Vancouver to get support. So these are really one of the differences. There are so many programs for women who are victims of domestic violence. Every city has probably more than one program. In Vancouver, there are 7 programs altogether that work with women that are victims of either sexual and or domestic violence. And some of the programs will work with victims of both. Battered Women's Support Services work with women that are victims of battering. VSAC is a program for women and children, and they work with sexual abuse and domestic violence. Act 2 also works with both issues for women. Vancouver Rape Relief only works with sexual assault, but I think if a woman called them up, they would not turn her away and say, sorry, we can't help you. They would either provide some assistance or they would make sure she's connected to one of the other programs that's more directly mandated to work with domestic violence. But the point is there are a lot of options for women in Vancouver. There are more options for women in Vancouver than there are for men in the entire country. And I'm hoping that that'll change. CAFE is trying to get programs set up for men in Toronto, Calgary, Edmonton, I suppose. Ottawa, Vancouver. So the will is there. There are people behind it, but we're really kind of pushing a rock uphill because without the funding streams to support these programs and without the public understanding that this is a serious issue, it's difficult to find the support that we need to really get these programs going. I called several government ministries, provincial government in BC about getting funding for my program. And I just kept getting referred to somebody else. And the one program that I did contact, that they are responsible for funding transition houses for women and children. And so when I asked them, they said, well, our mandate is transition houses for women and children. And I said, but you're a provincial government body. Don't you represent all taxpayers of the province? And to not provide services for men as well as women is sexist. They didn't really answer that. They kind of, they just really non-committal response. But then she said they wouldn't have program money, which is, for ongoing support, but they might have capital funds. Well, I'm happy with capital funds. If we can buy a location with capital funding, we already support our clinical programs, but if we can save the rent every month, the nearly $4,000 a month that we pay, that's quite enough over 12 months. My math is really bad. What's times 12? $48,000 or something like that. That's a significant amount of money that we could save that would not only support this housing, maintenance or whatever, but also would provide some cash to subsidize our program. So I've got a proposal that's all ready to go in. We're also going after a couple other sources to subsidize that particular project. We'll see what happens. Well, where do we go from here? I know that today I wanted to talk about sort of, some of the healing interventions that we use. And that's probably on another program on my memory stick, but I wanted to sort of do some brainstorming amongst the group. There are CAFE representatives here, so maybe if you can sort of give me provide an overview for whoever is watching this. What is going on in Calgary? What's going on in Edmonton in terms of trying to get something like this in place?
It's been a difficulty even getting people aware of the issue. It's a conservative province, right. And there's issues, like it's not as, I don't know, for lack of a better word, progressive as Vancouver or Toronto. So we have
right.
That obstacle as well to deal with. We have a legacy though of having one of the only men's alternative shelters in Calgary with Earl Silverman. I don't know if you know who that is.
No.
Earl Silverman. And we have local advocates, like a lot of grassroots representation here. So, but we're looking at different methods to get, Calgary and Edmonton have, we work together quite a bit and we discuss how we want to go. But our long-term goal is to have a shelter in Edmonton. So different means to that end would be like capital cost funding, and we're going to be persistent in that, or we're going to maybe look for a house donation. But right now we have a part-time Canadian Centre for Men and Families, so it's a drop-in service center in Calgary, and Dan McKinnon, Dr. Dan McKinnon in Calgary and Carol have made a lot of headway in Calgary. They have a part-time center there. It's a donated space from a reputable psychology clinic. They donate a space once a week, I believe, to having a physical office. And in Edmonton, we don't have the funds for a physical location, but we have a virtual center. So that can be helpful, and even validating men, a lot of them have never been believed in their life. So even just having a virtual center is better than nothing, and so that they come. And then we've researched a lot of resources. We work a lot by referral and referring to the partners that we and the rapports that we've made with different agencies. And so that's how we have gotten around on having a physical location. So we've been creative in our approach that way. Right.
Okay, so some of the programs you're talking about, there are sort of day programs that they're more of a treatment kind of thing?
Yeah, they're drop-in support centers. Because of the legal issues, there's not a lot of options. That's very constraining, obviously. Because legally, like, there's issues with, well, basically, I believe Karen Strawn, our local advocate, she's put it, men have 3 options in domestic abuse. They can either stay and take it, or they can risk child abduction, or they can leave their child with the abuser. So that's what the men's options are, and none of those are great. But like I said,
Absolutely.
like the place to start is at least raising awareness. And we've been on a campaign of education in Alberta. And we've shown the red pill and given Karen Strawn a platform across the province. And our next event is in Red Deer, and we're going to be showing the red pill there. And that has a good illustration of, because a lot of people have trouble even like you can give them statistics, but a lot of them have never really wrapped their mind around what the situation looks like when a man is being abused. So sometimes they don't understand the dynamic, but if you can show them, you know, like a video clip or something of a man sleeping on a couch, and then someone comes along and pours boiling water on him, or something like that, to kind of illustrate, especially if there's kids involved, like in the middle of the violence.
Yeah.
So sometimes you have to explain it to people so they can see the dynamic. Because like you said, like there's like a lot of cliches that people have or stereotypes about it, and they don't really understand the need until you show them. And sometimes you need a video or something to show them like what's actually going down, and like why we need interventive services for men as well as women and children. Right.
Okay, so certainly the effort is there, and I think you're absolutely right. Raising awareness makes a big difference, because if the general public understands these issues, they're more likely to be supportive.
Yeah, and they'll donate and help us with a house donation possibly. But like the education campaign has to come first. I don't think that it's going to work if we just drop numbers and do it that way.
Well, one option, we talk about having a house donated, you might go to the city, because there is city-owned property. And in Vancouver, every fall, they have a forced sale of properties that are delinquent in their property tax. And if somebody doesn't bid on a certain property, or if they bid on the property but then don't follow through on the purchase, then it goes back to the city. And these are residential facilities. And if the city has a property like this, rather than putting it on the auction block or carrying it because it didn't go, they've got this property that they have to be responsible for. So it might be a possibility that they would donate a house if it's...
Trying to even get like a space, a publicly owned space, even for a men's peer circle, like where men can get together, and that would facilitate like domestic abuse or any kind of issue that men have, that they can go to, per se, a safe space. And we're having trouble getting through to people, you know, some of the powers that be that have this property. So like it's been, you know, like back and forth with letters and explaining. Like I said, we have come from this is a very conservative area.
Right.
And so there's those issues. Like where you're from in Vancouver, it might be different. But
well, not a whole lot different, but hopefully a bit better.
Yeah, so that's, but like I said, we went through a lot of effort to bring you here because we want things to change, and we're also going to be contributing to Canada as a whole by like we've recorded you today, and like we're trying to be part of the wider, like being part of the wider Canadian network is also connecting to those like national resources. So yeah, we're trying our best with what we have. Right.
Something I was just thinking of. I think I mentioned it yesterday, but a documentary on female sex offenders called When Girls Do It. That is being held by CTV. They currently have the rights. The production company had the rights to that for X number of years, and then their rights to that documentary expired, and then it was taken over by CTV that sponsored it. So I think that people can call into CTV and say, do you have any plans to broadcast When Girls Do It? I've heard about this. I think it would really be important to see that again. Is that any way that it can be broadcast again, or is it possible to get a copy? Now, if we get a lot of calls from people asking CTV to show When Girls Do It, they might put it back on the air.
It might help if we become more organized. We've been really fragmented, like all the various related interest groups, but we're working on that too. Like we have representatives here from a few different local groups. And so Alberta has to come together, our groups, and start cooperating. So there's a few different reasons, but that's a good point that if we had like a concentrated campaign with our media and whatnot, that would be let them know that the majority has this interest in these topics.
A colleague of mine in Ottawa, we were in New York at a conference, and we talked about, it was an idea that I have, and he kind of got on board with it, starting a Canadian Association of Male Survivor Services, and the acronym would be CAMS, kind of easy to remember. And I think he mounted a website for a while, but we figured that there would be 3 levels of membership. There would be a full-on agency like mine and his that are dedicated solely to providing services for male survivors of sexual abuse. Another membership would be a program within a broader range, a broader interest group, like say Family Services may have a male survivor program under that umbrella, or private practitioners that work with male survivors. So 3 kinds of memberships, and the idea was to have a national affiliation of programs that provide services for men. And it kind of just sort of fell apart. I don't really get into it. Was kind of complicated as to why that happened, but we were going to have a Western chapter, which I'd be kind of the head of. There'd be an Eastern chapter that he'd be the head of, and there'd be a Central chapter, maybe in Winnipeg or someplace. But we could actually have subgroups in every province. So Alberta, there would be a chapter that would coordinate all the programs in Alberta, and they would all be members of CAMS. I still think it's worth considering, because a national network of male survivor services, every time that there's an issue where we need support, let's say we're applying for funding to get a shelter for men in Vancouver, every member of CAMS could write in a letter of support talking about how important it is. And then anyone that's successful in getting a program together for male survivors of sexual abuse can then support all the other people trying to get one together, saying, we've done this, it's worked, it's proven to be important, not only to the men who need it, but also the community in which these men live. So I think something like CAMS could really help coordinate all our efforts. There was a program in Nanaimo that's had their funding withdrawn. I think we talked about it yesterday. So if every men's program in the country wrote a letter of support that this program in Nanaimo needs to keep their funding, that would really help.
Do you think that we could be connected through something like CAFE, which has representation and has done networking quite well, actually?
Yeah, I mean, CAFE is certainly valuable, but my understanding, CAFE, it's a Canadian Association for Equality. It's not just about men, but the focus is men because we see the inequity in programs for men. But at some point, if the balance of programs for men and women finds more of a parity, then CAFE is going to take a much broader stance. They're going to be addressing all kinds of issues of inequality. They could be along racial lines, not just gender lines, socioeconomic lines. So anytime that CAFE recognizes that there's some kind of imbalance in terms of equality, they're going to address that. Right now, the focus is largely on men's issues, but eventually CAFE is, hopefully, if we're successful at getting men's issues recognized, then there'll be more of a balance. And CAFE will be looking at a lot of different kinds of inequality.
I don't think that they're going to go like that kind of scope. I mean, I think that would be impractical. And I'm in CAFE, and I'm on the board of directors at CAFE, and I think that that's more of a marketing. Like it is true that we value equality across the board, but like realistically, like how soon would that be that there's equality for men and boys? Like I don't.
Oh, right. I just think that the name implies that the issue is about equality. It's not specifically about men, although the focus is on men's issue because men's issues are way behind others.
Yeah, and it's not just the advocacy like through CAFE. Like they have the Canadian Centre for Men and Families, and now we have 4 physical locations. There's one that just opened up in London. So there's that whole like applied. There's the theory and the advocacy in the group. They have that whole section of their organization that's applied with the services. So yeah, so we like part of the reason why you're here is to help us develop the services.
Yeah. Well, I think the name doesn't really matter. I think it's the energy that needs to coalesce so that we can all support each other.
Yeah.
And whether we're under the CAFE umbrella or the CAMS umbrella, or everybody's just under their own name, we have the same spirit. We're looking for adequate services for men, because we're really talking about the health of our communities. It's not about men as much as it is about healthy communities, and we cannot have healthy communities if anybody's issues are neglected.
Well, that's one way that we've spoken to some of the authorities, is like pointing out the effect on the entire family when a man commits suicide.
Yeah.
How does that, and like it's unfortunate that we have to always circle it back around women and children.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's the only way to get through to people, is explain like this is
Well,
the
yeah.
impact. I think it costs, like, the mayor from the Center for Suicide Prevention, she said it costs like over $1 million every time someone commits suicide. So that's the cost on our, society.
Yeah.
It's very expensive, and like it's unfortunate that we can't focus on the humanity of men and boys, but there's, it affects, like, just a suicide affects the entire family. And then if you think about an untreated male that has all this baggage and it's never been, the impact that, his dysfunctional behavior would have on his whole family, like, they become traumatized too, so there's a huge cost.
Yeah. Well, I think I don't have a problem really thinking about the impact on children, because if you're a child and you have either parent that's dysfunctional, it's going to have an impact on you. And when you have a parent that commits suicide, that's a pain that you carry the rest of your life.
Yes.
If you have to say, well, my father committed suicide when I was 5, I never got a chance to really know him. What an incredible loss that might be.
Yeah.
I had a client in Vancouver. I think just, cases always come to mind when we talk about these things. And this man was sexually abused by a scout leader who was also an RCMP officer. And it was a big court case in Vancouver. And he was so overwhelmed by the trauma that he was not present. He loves his children, he cares about his children, but he just could not be present. And that really pained him to know that he was failing his children by being so sullen and depressed and dissociated all the time that he couldn't be there for his kids in the way he wanted to be. And he's one of God knows how many cases.
Oh, there's so many more.
Oh yeah, infinite number of cases. Like, we have no idea what's really out there.
Not
Like,
just in the family level, like not even the community level.
Yeah.
That it has.
Yeah. So I don't know what's going to be next. Okay. If anyone wants to make note of the contact information for BC Society for Male Survivors, this is where we are. So head office is in 3126 West Broadway in Vancouver, B6K2H3. And our main number is 604-682-6482. The website is www.bc-malesurvivors. We also have locations in Port Coquitlam, Surrey, right now Courtney on Vancouver Island. We did have 2 of our former staff members are living in Nanaimo now, and one of them was seeing a couple of our clients, but they've both gotten so busy with their full-time job at the college there that they are not currently seeing any of our clients. So Nanaimo is not an active location, and Port Coquitlam is sort of off and on. But right now, Vancouver, Surrey, and Courtney are 3 fully active locations. I think obviously, if you don't live in BC, our services are not easily accessible, but our website is quite informative. It's a good way for survivors to start out exploring this possibility. They can go online. We have some articles there. I think there's a reference, or there are links to a couple of podcasts that I've done. I think I've done 3. I think they're all there. There's some articles that have been written. There's a link to the Cost of Silence video that we're producing. There's the short 10 or 15-minute version, and we're still working on the longer version. So a lot of men that have a lot of trouble coming forward, it's a really good way for them to start exploring these issues without really coming forward and identifying themselves. So I really encourage men who are recognizing that this is probably an issue in their lives to at least go online and do some exploring that way, because it's really anonymous. There's also an organization in the States. It's called malesurvivor.org, I think is their website. I used to be on the board of directors of that organization, and it's an international organization that's primarily in the States, but there are members in Canada, Great Britain, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and they have discussion boards or discussion rooms. I don't know what you call it. My technology is quite up to speed, but there are a number of different subject streams, and you can go online and you can engage in an online discussion. And a lot of guys go that route because they can anonymously say, I'm a survivor, this is what I'm struggling with, how do I deal with it? And there's always a member of the board of directors of that organization monitoring each one of the discussion rooms. So there's someone there to interact and to provide some more of a professional perspective. So that's also a really good option for people that are new to the whole issue of dealing with sexual abuse. Again, they don't have to come forward and identify themselves. It's anonymous. And that's a really good starting point for a lot of men who just are so uncomfortable with the issue that they don't really quite know what to do. I think I have to switch my PowerPoints here, so just give me a second while I figure out how to do this.
USB drive.
Okay.
Just double click on the file, it should pop up.
Yeah, I'm trying to decide which one I want to do.
Okay, just double click when you're ready.
Okay. So I'm gonna have to scan through this for a minute just to make sure I'm with the right one. Some of this is gonna be repetition, but it should be something. Yeah, I think this will work. These are some of the therapeutic interventions that we use when working with male survivors. I've talked about some of these, but I didn't really give a full explanation of what exactly do we do with these things. Normalization, I mentioned that yesterday. It's really helping men understand that their reactive behavior is typical. And so I would say, well, of course you would react that way. Who wouldn't? You know, when you are violated by family members, for example, it makes perfect sense that you would not trust anyone. It's not that there's something wrong with you that you're distrusting. It makes perfect sense given the context of your abuse. I use the example of a war zone. When you live in a war zone, you dash from cover to cover. You don't hang out in the open. If you hear a loud sound, you jump because you think it's a bomb going off. And then when you move to a peaceful environment, that behavior persists for a while. So a lot of male survivors are exhibiting the kind of coping strategies and weird reaction patterns that make sense within the context of the abuse. But the abuse might have happened 20, 30 years ago, and they're still reacting as if it's current. And they think they're crazy because they know that it seems out of sorts to them, but they don't really recognize that dynamic, that it's not just enough to say, oh, well, I'm an adult now, I'm not being abused. There's so much going on that needs to be addressed and resolved before you can really shift out of those old dysfunctional behaviors into a more functional way of living your life. I think I may have talked about cognitive restructuring, but that was a term that I came up with myself. It's probably nothing new, but it's my way of thinking about it. It's really about recognizing erroneous belief systems that are a product of the trauma. People that were abused by the majority of their family members, the message to them is that there's no such thing as sexual boundaries. It's kind of like anything goes. You know, you can just sort of impose yourself on anybody. We have a client that grew up in a neighborhood where it seems like in this community, there was sexual offense, there was incest and all kinds of stuff going all over. I mean, everyone in the neighborhood seemed to be into it. The kids would be running around the neighborhood nude most of the time. The parents of our client married him to his sister when they're both children. You know, they had this pseudo marriage. It wasn't legal, of course, but as far as the kids know that they were married. Sexually abused by pretty much every adult in the community. And so the idea of any kind of sexual boundaries are just incomprehensible to this client. And of course, he ended up offending later on as an adult, because the idea of something being inappropriate was never part of his experience growing up, because anything goes. So that was a belief system that we had to really address and help him embrace a new concept of sexuality, where there's such a thing as informed consent. There's such a thing as a relationship dynamic. There's such a thing as mutual respect. And there are, peer groups. When you're 15, your peer range is only 1 or 2 years either direction. When you're 20, it's maybe 3 or 4 years either direction. When you're 30, maybe it's 10 years. And the older you get, the larger your peer group goes. When you're 50, you could have a relationship with a 30-year-old, because that 30-year-old person is an adult person. They know what they're all about. They're capable of providing informed consent. Now, I'm 70. I don't know that I want to be involved with a 40-year-old, but that's legal, because I could potentially find a 40-year-old partner that's mature, knows who they are, and can provide informed consent. If they want to be involved with a 70-year-old, that's their business, but it's certainly not illegal. But these are concepts that people that have been victimized don't get. So the idea of a peer range is incomprehensible to people that have gone through the experience like my client that I just referred to. Another concept that we work with a lot is the concept of the inner child. John Bradshaw talks about this in some of his writing. John Bradshaw does a lot of work around addictions and that kind of thing, and a lot of family work, family dynamic kinds of stuff. He talks about the need for the adult self to parent the inner child. And the way I interpret what he is saying is that we always have to parent the inner child. But I really believe that if you consciously bring the child aspect of the self into the therapeutic process, that whatever part of the self is embodied in the inner child will begin to mature and catch up, so that you're a mature adult on all levels. Now, the idea of the inner child is that when you've been a victim of childhood trauma, part of you is stuck in the trauma. So on some level, you're still the 5-year-old that was abused, or the 12-year-old that was abused. And sometimes working with clients, they will shift into the appearance of being a child. I was working with a client one day, and he kind of regressed to being that child. And I really found myself talking to a 10 or 11-year-old boy, because that's when the abuse took place. And I was talking about concepts that he couldn't get, because he was in the mindset of a 12-year-old. 10, 11, 12. I can't really quite nail down exactly, because his abuse started when he was earlier, and it continued until he was around 12 years old. So I was talking to somebody around 10, 11, 12, but some of the concepts that I was talking about were incomprehensible to him. So when I caught on to that, I started talking to him as if he was a child. And I had used the word infinite. He said, "What does that mean? I don't know what that means." And I said, "Well, you take a pinch of sand, you put it in the palm of your hand. It might take you a while, but you could potentially count each grain of sand in that little pinch of sand in your hand. Imagine all the sand on a beach, and then imagine all the beaches in the world, and all the grains of sand that there are on this planet. Even that isn't infinite, but it's a lot closer than these little pinch of sand in the palm of your hand." He said, "Oh, I could get that," because it was something concrete. Now, an adult, I can say infinite, they know what I'm talking about. But in that moment, he was in the consciousness and the emotional state of a child. I really see this a lot when we start talking about the abuse. When a person has a flashback, or they they start talking about abuse, they go right back to being the helpless, frightened, overwhelmed child. And then you really have to work with them as if they are a child, because they're in a place where you really have to be where they are. They can't be where you're at as a fully cognitive adult. One of our staff is a former elementary school teacher, and she was really good at working with clients who were in that state of mind, because she's so used to working with children and being able to control a classroom full of third graders. You know, that you have to have a real good skill set to keep your third graders under control. And so when she's working with a client that's regressed into that state, then she will work with them as if they're a child, and is very effective. Now, there's an inner child exercise that I do, and I came up with it, but I can't really say it was my idea, because I've heard other people talking about it. So I don't know, I think there's such a thing as tapping into the cosmic void, and you connect with those ideas and these concepts that are out there floating somewhere in the depth of the collective human consciousness. But the idea is that if you're right-handed, your right hand is controlled by your left brain. And your left brain is the cognitive, rule-bound, grammar, syntax, causal relationships, linear thinking. And your right brain, that's where all the creative thinking outside the box, that sort of haptic involvement with life, where you're kind of right in the thick of it, you're not really analyzing it, you're just experiencing it. So if you're right-handed, you're typically communicating, or you're expressing yourself through writing with your right hand, which is this left brain, that really structured, rule-bound way of thinking. So what I do is I draw a line down the middle of the page, and I ask people to, for the adult, to come up with an opening statement for the child, that inviting the child to speak. So it might be, we just had a therapy session, how are you feeling right now? Or I was just talking about what happened when I was 5 years old. How are you feeling right now? Or simply, how are you doing? Do you feel like talking to me today? Then on your left hand, on the other side of the page, you answer on behalf of the child. And what's happening is that the right side of the brain, which is the more emotional, not rule-bound, not thinking within the box, but outside the box, is responding. And also, excuse me, I would like everybody in the room to try writing your name with your left hand and see what it looks like. Go ahead, do it now.
Does it count if I'm left-handed? Does it count if I'm left-handed?
Yes.
You do it the other way around. Your left hand would be your dominant hand, your right would be the non-dominant. So yeah, if you're left-handed, it's different. If you're left-handed, your right brain is the cognitive, rule-bound, linear thinking, you know, obey the law kind of side of the brain, and your left brain would be the emotional, non-rule-bound way of thinking. So if you tried writing your name with your left hand, or your non-dominant hand, does it not look like when you're a child learning how to write for the first time? So I think that also helps you kind of go back in time a little bit and reconnect with your child self, struggling to try to make your hand work. So there's not only the right-left brain issue going on, but there's also that reconnecting with the child trying to struggle to learn how to form letters and form words. So the adult asks the question, how are you feeling? Do you feel like talking? I don't know if I want to talk to you. Well, why not? And basically you build a dialogue down the page. And I remember a couple dialogues that really stand out. One of them, I'd worked with this man probably 25 years ago, but two statements in his dialogue really stick with me. The child said, "You're a fucking asshole and I hate you." And the adult said, "You're a sniveling little brat and I wish you would die." Until I heard that dialogue, I had no idea that this man had so much internalized self-contempt. And that really gave us a target to work on for quite a few weeks. He hated himself. He blamed himself for everything in his life that had gone wrong. He actually had a couple missing fingers that was an accident at work or something that he felt very self-conscious and self-blaming because what an idiot, I got my own fingers cut off kind of a thing. So he had a lot of self-contempt going on, mostly around the abuse, but also the lost finger was a contributing factor. So that really gave us something to work on. Another dialogue went something along the lines of, the adult said, "Do you feel like talking to me today?" "Well, not really." "Well, why not?" "I don't know if I can trust you." "Well, what do you mean you can't trust me?" "You don't take very good care of me." "Can you give me an example of how I don't take care of you?" "Well, I don't like those nasty people at work." Now, he worked in a toxic environment where people are kind of sarcastic, sniping each other. "Isn't it funny? Ha ha." And so the adult said, "Well, I have to go to work because I've got to pay the rent and buy food." The child came up with this brilliant insight. "Yes, but do you have to go to lunch with them?" Because during lunchtime, the toxicity level rose because everybody's sitting around the lunchroom sniping each other. When you're busy doing your job, you don't have the time to do that. So from then on, during lunch breaks, the adult, this individual, my client, would meet a healthy friend for lunch or would go off on his own. So by listening to the vulnerability that was coming from the inner child, he was able to make healthier choices and honor the discomfort that the child had in this toxic environment. So I've had clients and staff members who kind of thought this sounds a little bit kind of flaky. One of my staff came up and said to me when he said, "My client is really stuck. We've tried this, we've looked at this, we've looked at that. We can't figure out why we're stuck. We just can't seem to move forward." So I gave him this exercise, and he said, "Okay, well, I'll try it." But he was thinking, well, it's pretty weird. But he was desperate to try anything, and so he did, and he came back to me afterwards, and he said, "When you told me that, I thought you were kind of flaky, but you know, I tried it, and it really worked. It opened things up, and we really started moving forward." And when I've worked with this with people, so most of the people really kind of connect with it. When they use it as an ongoing strategy, I really do witness a maturation process so that whatever's embodied in the child aspect of the self begins to catch up and be more mature across the board. But we're doing all these other things. You know, we're talking about boundaries and, you know, the shame and the guilt. We're addressing all the impact of the abuse, and that helps contribute. But because the child is consciously brought into that therapeutic process, the child is benefiting from all of the dialogue around blame and boundaries and family dynamics and all that kind of thing. So it is a very powerful tool working with survivors. I usually like trying it with survivors in the session because they can be quite surprised by what comes up. I was working with a client one day and I suggested this exercise, and the adult said, "Hello, are you there?" And then took the pen in the other hand and started to touch the page and threw the pen down and jumped back. And I said, "What happened? What was that?" "I really felt like there was some other self and it freaked me out." I said, "Okay, let's leave it alone today. But I think let's try it next week. But let's just sort of refocus ourselves for today," because it was kind of shocking to have this real sense of another self. Now, it's not the same as a dissociative identity disorder, which commonly people understand as split personality. The current term is dissociative identity disorder. When a person is so deeply traumatized, they actually fragment into different identities. And each identity copes with a different aspect of life. One personality will go to work. Another personality will drive the car. One personality will engage in an intimate relationship. One personality will be the assertive one. One personality will be the angry one. So whatever the psychological need is or the situational need is, a different personality will come forward. Each personality can have a different name, can have a different gender, can speak with a different accent, can have a different history as far as each personality thinks that they have a different history. Now, when you work with somebody with a dissociative identity disorder, the goal is not to do away with any of the personalities. The goal of working with someone with DID is for each personality to benefit from the skills and the knowledge of other personalities. So when these two personalities really learn from one another and absorb the skills of one another, the boundary that separates them kind of disappears. And these personalities kind of blend. It's not about doing away with these personalities, but incorporating all the qualities of each individual personality. So I've worked with DID clients that will say to me, if you want to get rid of any of my personalities, I'm walking out of the door. And I said, well, why would you want to get rid of them? Because they all embody valuable traits and skills and abilities. Why would we want to get rid of them? I'm hoping that maybe your personalities will learn from each other and benefit from their collective knowledge. But no, we don't want to get rid of them. In fact, ultimately, you do want them all to blend together into a singular personality. But you don't want to frame it that way because you don't want people thinking that they're going to be losing anything. They're not. They're just bringing all of that found of knowledge and skill set. You're kind of bringing it all together. You know, that's what we're all doing in this room. We're learning from one another. And we're all richer for the experience. And so with multiple personality disorder, it's pretty much the same thing. They're all learning from each other and becoming richer and fuller. And then what divides them is no longer as relevant. So inner child work is quite positive. There's something else that I do. It's not on my list here, but it is something that we often do. I believe that confrontation is a necessary part of recovery. But it's not always safe to actually confront your offender. Maybe they're violent, maybe they're just not prepared to take responsibility, they're psychologically, emotionally abusive, but you can do it symbolically. So what I often get my clients to do is to write a letter to their offender. This is not a letter that's going to get mailed. Two things are happening. You're reaching within yourself and you're reaching into this swirling soup of thoughts and feelings and reactions and flashbacks, and you're organizing that all into constructed language. So when you formulate this letter, you have to organize all that stuff in order to express it on the page. The other thing that you're doing is you're breaking the rule of thou shalt not tell anyone. Because offenders do that. They don't want you to tell anyone. They use threats, they use trickery, they use making you feel responsible for the abuse, anything that they can do to keep you silent. So when you write that letter, you're finding your voice, you're articulating, you're saying in the letter, this is what you did to me, this is how it's affected me, and this is how I feel about it. And sometimes you can say, and this is what I want you to do about it. Now again, this is not a letter that's going to be mailed, but it's a way to really identify all those thoughts and feelings and express them in a way that's quite empowering for the victim. And then I have them read it out to the therapist, and that's where you're breaking the silence. You're sharing all that with somebody. Or not often, but sometimes people have chosen to do this in group. And so they're sharing it with a room full of people, like 6 or 8 people they're sharing that with. So they are definitely breaking the silence. And that can be a really powerful part of this too. But what I've done sometimes, I'll have the inner child write the letter. And so sometimes it's hard for them to read their own writing afterwards, but it's that child part of themselves, finding their strength and the confidence to say, you hurt me and I'm pretty mad about it. And the language and the syntax will be very more like how a child communicates. And so you know that it's coming from the child aspect of the self. And it really helps that maturation process that I referred to earlier. Now, sometimes the letter goes to other people. I had a client that wrote a letter to his mother. Now, the father was violent, but the mother put up with it for years. And so in his letter, it's like, why didn't you get us the hell out of that house? You know, we could have moved in with your relatives. We could have, why did you stay with that man when he was beating you and beating us? What is wrong with you? So, I don't know exactly. That was the spirit of the letter, and it's not a paraphrasing necessarily, but it was interesting. When he wrote the letter at home, it was like he was writing a story. There was just no emotional content. He wrote this letter, he came into therapy, and he started reading to me, and he could barely get through it. He started emotionally breaking down. He did get through the letter, but there was so emotional content in sharing that information with me. So I say to people that you can write a letter to anyone that you've got an issue with. The offender, people that knew about it, turned a blind eye, the system that would not intervene and separate the offender from the family that denied the abuse and aligned themselves with the offender rather than with the victim. So anything that you've got a grievance with, you could write this letter. Again, the idea is not to mail the letter, but there have been a few occasions when clients said, I want to mail this. And so before we do, we talk about all the possible repercussions. What if this is what happens as a result? What if this is the response you get? What if this is the response you get? So when they consider all the possible repercussions of mailing that letter, and if they feel really prepared to deal with all those possible outcomes, then I say, it's your choice. It's not up to me, it's up to you. We've talked about all the repercussions. If you decide you still want to go ahead, then that's your choice. But for the most part, it's an exercise that stays within the context of therapy. And it really is quite powerful and quite effective. And like I said, the inner child can do that as well as the adult self. So that's quite powerful. Family systems is something that we also do. We have different kinds of family. I think I gave a couple examples. There's a successful family where everybody is high achievers, and you're a barista at a Starbucks or someplace, or you're working at McDonald's, and everybody else has got these high-flying professional jobs. And it can be felt quite daunting. Even though no one's pressuring you or saying anything, then you're feeling it. I'm a failure. Everybody else in the family is successful, and I'm just making coffees. What's wrong with me? And then you've got the family that are really not a very functional family, and anyone that shows any sign of functionality are sabotaged by the rest of the family, because the more successful that person is, the lower they all feel by comparison. So that's another family style. There's also, there's actually a terminology for this, and I can't remember what it was because I was dealing with this part of my Overcoming Procrastination workshop many years ago. But a family that's basically very kind of disconnected. Everybody's kind of off doing their own thing. There's not a lot of interaction. There's very little or no affection whatsoever in the family. They don't seem to be kind of interested. Everybody's kind of off doing their own thing, and they're just not connected. This is something you might see in a more wealthy family, because a girlfriend and I temporarily lived with a family outside of Victoria, and they lived in this beautiful, huge mansion where the entry hall was bigger than the typical bachelor suite, and it was 2 stories high, the entry hall, and had a fireplace big enough to walk into. The dining room had a table, this big, long oak table that would seat 24 people. This place was the largest private residence on Vancouver Island. There were 5 of us in the house. There was the professor, retired professor, his wife, and one of their kids. A daughter was living there, and then my girlfriend and I. You could be home all day and not know if there was anyone in the house, because we're all off in our own section of the house. Literally, you'd have to walk through the entire house to find out whether anybody else was there. Now, if that was a family, we would not be very connected. We'd be kind of off with very little interaction. And then you've got the opposite, which is families that are so enmeshed that everybody's in everybody else's business, and you don't go anywhere except you go almost as a unit. This happens a lot with couples, where couples cannot go anywhere if they don't go together. And so nobody's allowed to have any kind of independent activity. Like the man can't go off and join a bowling league, and the women can't go off and join the garden club because they can't go off and do things separately. Oh, that's not allowed. So a family that's so enmeshed and so tightly bound, there's no room for individual ideation or development, because you're part of a unit, you're not an individual. And that can be very suffocating, and really impedes personal growth and development, because you can't do anything that will take you outside of this enmeshed family unit. So that's also a very unhealthy family dynamic. Now, somewhere in the middle of all these different family dynamics, there's one that's healthy. What I consider a healthy dynamic is where everyone is allowed to have their own individuality, that you're able to pursue your own interests, and you're encouraged. And there's interest in what you're doing. Like, you come home from a sports team, or you come home from being involved with a theater group, or you come home from some club that you belong to, and parents would say, oh, tell me about your day. You know, and they're actually interested. You know, in my family, my brother was into sports, and my dad he would go to every game and every practice that my brother was in. And so my brother really felt valued, you know, and I was much more independent. I was really kind of more on my own. I wouldn't go so far as to say I was neglected, because I was certainly loved by my parents, but my brother and father had this great camaraderie. So my brother felt really valued because of his skill as a sportsman. My sister was academic. She was successful. She was on the honor roll all the time. And in high school, she actually had published poetry. And she got a lot of acknowledgement and attention, encouragement around that. So again, she felt valued because of what she was doing. My mother could go off and get involved. She had a couple part-time jobs here and there, and she joined the garden club for a while. My dad would be in golf tournaments and bowling leagues, and and I was involved with theater. So we were all allowed to go off and do the things that were interesting to us and supported in doing that. My dad questioned, well, why do you want to be an actor? You can never make a living as an actor. But actually, I did a TV commercial one time, and I worked for 20 minutes and made $70. So I went home afterwards and said, Dad, do you make $70 in 20 minutes? Well, I just did. So anyway, I ended up not in acting. I'm doing this instead, but I'm not going to get into that story. But the thing is that we all felt loved by our parents. We all felt like we were allowed to be who we are. There was never any wing clipping going on by either of our parents. We were encouraged to really explore who we really are. My dad always used to kind of tease me about being stubborn, but that was my own personality. I was my own person. And he would kind of joke about it, but he also honored that. He respected that. And he was visiting me once in Vancouver, and I was speaking at a conference, and he sat in on my presentation. And I think it's the first time that he really got what I do. And he was sitting in the back row, and he'd say, "That's my son." He was saying to the woman next to him. He was really proud of me because he could finally see what my job is all about. It's something he couldn't quite get because he worked for the telephone company, and you know, working for the telephone company is not really very similar to counseling or teaching. Anyway, and we had good boundaries. I think I talked about that yesterday. We had pretty good boundaries in our home. We didn't sit around talking about boundaries over the dinner table, but they were respected. So nobody's family is perfect, but you know, mine was pretty close, and I don't really have much in the way of complaints about how I was brought up. So we were not the enmeshed family, we're not the distant family, we're not the highly successful family where if you're not a high achiever, you're a failure, none of that. And we weren't a family of dysfunctional people that keep dragging you down if you have any modicum of success. So I think overall we were pretty balanced, and I was lucky to have grown up in that kind of a family, and it gives me a juxtaposition. When I hear about the family dynamics of some of my clients, I'm thinking, wow, you know, when I think about the kind of family I grew up, I really get how devastating it must have been for you to grow up in that kind of family environment. So it's really kind of helpful to be able to draw those comparisons. I'm kind of jumping ahead to the genogram at the bottom because it's kind of fits with the whole family systems idea. A genogram is basically what we understand is a family tree. But the difference is that when you're doing your genogram, instead of just, you know, drawing out who's married and who the kids are and who the grandkids are, you're also using colors and symbols to represent certain patterns within the family. Say, you know, the men are square and the women are circles or whatever. So all the alcoholics in the family dynamic their shape is in a color, pick a color, red, let's say. All the sex offenders are a different color in the family. If a person is deceased, there's a double line that separates their circle or square from the rest of the family tree. If a couple is divorced, there's a one slash line between them to indicate that they're no longer a couple. There's a number of things that you can do to represent certain patterns. And what you might realize is that maybe the oldest child in every generation is the one that's exhibiting certain behavior patterns like alcoholism or workaholism, and maybe the youngest child in every generation is the one that's neglected because by then people are all busy doing their own thing. So the genogram really helps you see reoccurring patterns intergenerationally in the family. And it really helps understand how it is that your life turned out to be a way it was because you fall into those patterns in a certain way. Now I have the medicine wheel on that same line because I was thinking about ways in which we can combine First Nations healing practices with the kind of psychotherapy that's kind of Euro-based, white psychotherapy. It's not exclusively Caucasian, but it's, just to separate it from First Nations healing traditions. The medicine wheel is the most common spiritual practice among North American First Nations. However, each First Nation has a different interpretation or different use of the wheel. But that circular pattern is reoccurring in all of their spiritual practices. And so I've hired somebody to come in and spend a day training my staff in his particular use of the medicine wheel. So there's the four direction, north, south, east, and west. There's the four races, yellow, black, white, red. There's the four elements, earth, air, wind, and fire. And there's also 8 houses in a 30-year developmental cycle. So if you imagine the medicine wheel being a clock with north being at 12 o'clock position, east being at the 3 o'clock position, etc. So you start in the middle in terms of your developmental process. You go up to the 3 o'clock position or the east position, and you go clockwise around the wheel, come back to the 3 o'clock and then back to center, and that's the 30-year cycle. On that wheel, there are 8 houses, and each house represents a different stage of development. And when we were doing this, assuming that the window that we were in, this group room that we're in, faced north, we all placed ourselves on the wheel where we were developmentally based on our age. And the 2 houses that I remember were the 2 houses that I was in between. I don't remember the rest of it. I've really got to dig up that wheel somewhere. It's somewhere in my messy office that looks like an explosion in a paper factory. But anyway, I was kind of right between the house of reflection and the house of protection. And the question that he put to us was, think about your relationship to the society based on what house you're in, and how is that stage in your development reflected in your work. Well, as executive director at the time, there was a lot of funding shifts going on in the agency at that time. And so I had just gone through a whole reflecting on what is the agency all about? What do we need? What direction do we need to grow? What really is the germane issues with this agency? So I was really reflecting on the issues that were relevant to the health and well-being of the society, of my nonprofit society. And so the House of Protection followed because I wanted to protect and ensure the ongoing continuity of the agency as I perceived it when I was in the House of Reflection. So it really made sense where I was at on this 8-house cycle. Now, the first time around the wheel, your reflection is going to be different. Say the first time around the wheel, you might be, how old was I at that time? You might be a 25-year-old, and you're thinking, I've got kids, I've got 4 kids already, and I'm 25 years old. I started way too early. I lost out on my youth. I'm kind of resentful about that, but I have responsibilities here. But then the next time around, when you're 30 years later, you're 55, your kids have all grown up and moved home. They're all creating their own life. Well, now what's my life all about? I'm no longer, I love my kids. They're always going to need me to be in their life, but they don't need me to parent them anymore. So what kind of meaning does my life have now? So the reflection 30 years later is going to be different. And the issues you're protecting 30 years later is going to be different than the first time around the wheel. So if you live long enough, you're going to go 3 times around the wheel. That's 90 years. And maybe, I hope to go around that wheel maybe 4 times, I'm not sure. I joke about being middle-aged, but I don't think I'm gonna live to be 140, but, you know, that's okay. I still feel like I'm middle-aged, so I'll just go along with it, you know. I do plan on living to be over 100, but, you know, anyway, so that's at least 3 times around the wheel. So by combining the genogram and the medicine wheel and those 8 houses of personal development, I figured, okay, first of all, you do the genogram, and then you identify who people are, who are the alcoholics, who are the offenders in the family, if there are. And then you look at the medicine wheel, at the time that we're being abused, where were key people at during that 8-house cycle on the wheel. So if mom was in the house of reflection and it was her first time around and she's a young mother, she's busy thinking about, I'm stuck with kids and an alcoholic husband, what am I doing? You know, her reflection would be very different. She's maybe not paying attention to what's going on for her kids. But if she's in the house of protection, she's going to be more protective of the kids. So by looking at where key people are on this 8-house developmental cycle, you get a better insight into their participation or failure to participate in the well-being of the children in that family. So I kind of put that idea out there, but I haven't really been able to sit down with the First Nations group and really see, is that really a practical application of these 2 traditions? Is it a way to bring them together? But I think that you want to be able to recognize and validate the traditional healing practices of any subgroup that you're working with, whether it be First Nations or an immigrant population. You want to honor their spirituality, their healing practices, but you also want to incorporate the kind of psychotherapy that we as Canadian therapists have been trained in. So the idea of combining traditions and psychotherapy training together, I think there's a lot of potential for that. And so it's something that I want to explore more because I do work with First Nations communities. The next thing on the list under family systems is boundaries, identity, and trust. Now, I think that these are very closely related. And so I talk about how these 3 concepts are very closely tied together. I start out by talking about boundaries. And I always have to count. I think there's about 5 different boundary areas that I identify. First of all, there's the sexual boundary, and I start with that one because as survivors of sexual abuse, that's the most relevant. So first of all, when you talk about sexual boundaries, there's your sexual orientation, gay, straight, bisexual. So once you identify where you fall on that continuum, and it is a continuum, Kinsey in his research suggested that there's a continuum from 0 to 6 in terms of sexual orientation. I always forget which end of the scale is which. Do you remember which? Okay. So 0 is 100% one thing, and 6 is 100% the other, you know, gay or straight. But in his research, Kinsey and his team interviewed thousands of people across North America, and their conclusion was that the majority of human beings are less than 100% of anything. They might be a 1 or a 6, or a 1 or a 5, which implies they're not 100%. It might be that you're 80-20. So if you're 80% heterosexual, then you're probably never going to explore that other 20% of your potential. But if you end up in prison, and you're going to be in prison for 15 years, you're probably going to explore that 20% because there is no such thing as co-ed prisons. It used to be that before the services, the military was integrated both genders, like say the Navy, for example. Before they had women in the Navy, there might be 500 guys on an aircraft carrier out to sea for several months at a time. Well, I'll tell you something, folks. Some of those guys are exploring sexuality with each other. Not that they're identify as gay, but there's no other options. But as soon as they get back to land, they're back to their wives and girlfriends. But what are you going to do when you're out to sea and you're feeling horny? So in other words, you've got that small percentage of that other possibility that most human beings are capable of. But that possibility may be such a small part of your sexual orientation that you say, okay, once in a while I can see a guy who's attractive, but yeah, I'm not really interested in going there. So that may be all it is. is the ability to recognize that, oh yeah, that guy's attractive, and be able to admit that to yourself. Or if you're a woman, oh, that woman's pretty attractive. Yeah, but no, not really interested in exploring that. So it's not 100%, it's not a black and white issue, it's a continuum. And if you're bisexual, that doesn't necessarily mean 50-50. It just means that that capacity to go either direction is greater than the people that are on the extremes. But society has a lot to do with that. If we have a society that does not support diversity, and that, you know, you go back about 40 or 50 years and homosexuality was a criminal offense. So anybody that had that potential would deny that potential. But in a more accepting society where diversity is okay, and it's legal to be gay, straight, bisexual, as long as you're finding consenting partners, it's nobody's business, then people have a greater opportunity to explore where they're at. And with survivors of sexual abuse, they're often so confused about their sexual orientation that having that discussion about human nature helps alleviate some of the anxiety they have around that confusion. And say, we don't really have to think about it right now. Let's get all the abuse baggage out of the way, and then you can figure out where you're at on that continuum. And you might find that you're right where you think you are, but you're so unsure about it because of all the abuse reactive issues that are going on that you're really not very clear about that. So that's the first boundary. But the other aspect around sexuality is, are you monogamous or are you polyamorous? Polyamorous means that you recognize that you're capable of having a loving relationship with more than one partner. And there are people that make that choice. And actually, from an anthropological perspective, monogamous heterosexuality is one of the common dynamics on the planet. If you go to a lot of other cultures, you will find polyamorous relationships. It's not just men with lots of wives, but you'll see in the Middle East, for example, some guy will arrive, some head of state will arrive with his entourage, with his 12 wives. You know, certainly people are aware of that, but there are also cultures where a woman may have several husbands. I took an anthropology course, and there was a video of this, I think it was a third world, a very primitive culture in the Amazon jungle or someplace. I can't remember now where it was. But this woman, they were looking at this one family dynamic. This woman had, I think, 3 different husbands. And in this film documentary thing, one of the husbands, the older husband, was not doing very well. He was sick. And he was in the hut, lying in bed, you know, kind of trying to recuperate. And the younger husband was out hunting and getting food to come back, and the younger husband was feeding the older husband. And there was no problem with that. But probably in that culture there was a greater number of men than there were women. And in order to balance that out, a woman could have several husbands. And actually, in cultures where you have that polyamorous kind of relationship dynamic, you're more likely to see an imbalance in the number of members of each gender. Where there's a lot of women and not very many men, then a man is going to have several wives. And in a culture where there are lots of men but not very many women, you're going to have a woman who have several husbands. And that's all about procreation and genetic diversity. I mean, it's a natural drive of human beings to procreate by having multiple partners. And then there are people that are not exactly polyamorous so much as believing in having an open relationship. 2 people that are very career-oriented, and maybe they travel a lot for their careers and they don't have a lot of time together. It's like, look, I know that we're going to be apart for the next 6 months because you're off doing your project and I'm off doing mine. And so as long as you practice safe sex, I really don't care what you do. Just don't bring it home. You know, and you know, let's just be honest and truthful about what's up. Now, the key there is communication. You have to be on the same page or it's not going to work out. But there are people who embrace that kind of relationship philosophy. That's their choice. It's their business. So sexuality, orientation, whether you're open or closed, etc. The last issue around sexuality is when you do it. Sex happens when both parties are up for it. It doesn't work if you're into it and your partner isn't. or conversely, that it's not supposed to happen. It used to be that, you know, a man could rape his wife and that's their business, but now it's against the law. Even in a committed relationship, sex doesn't happen unless both people are in the mood for it. So that's the last boundary issue around sexuality. The next boundary issue that I talk about is non-sexual physicality. And that's based primarily on the nature of the relationship. Everybody in this room I've met for the first time, so the only physical contact that's appropriate would be a handshake. Now, after spending 2 days together, there might be a real sense of affinity and maybe people might feel inclined to hug each other, but it's a very fraternal, kind of friendly kind of a hug. There's nothing romantic or sexual about it. The only time that there's really a lot of physical contact that really is not really based on relationship is on a crowded bus during rush hour. You know, you're packed into the bus or the SkyTrain and you're like this, and everybody's trying not to touch people, but you can't help it because, you know, you're packed in so tight that if you take a deep breath, you've touched 3 people. You know, you have to just cope with it, but you know, you deal with it. Now, there's only 2 people that have a right to have access to your entire body, and that's your intimate partner and your doctor. But if your doctor sees you in Safeway, they can't come up to you and say, cough for me. Context is another issue. It's not okay. So moving away from the kind of physical issues, the next issue is personal space. If you share a home with people, you have your room, they have their room. If you come home from work and you're stressed out, you can say, I've had a really stressful day. I need to go into my room and meditate for about 20 minutes. I don't want to be disturbed unless the place is on fire. You know, don't bother me for 20 minutes. I'll come out in 20 minutes and I'll help you prepare dinner. You have a right to that personal space. When you're in the bathroom, you know, sitting on the throne or having a shower or whatever, if you're in there, that's your personal time and you have a right to the privacy. So personal space is an important issue, whether it's family or roommates or whatever. You have a right to your privacy. You have a right to your quiet time if you need it. Also, this moves on to personal possessions. If you, say, have roommates, is it okay for them to use your CDs or to borrow your clothes or to borrow your car? Not without a discussion about what the parameters are. Way back in my early 20s, I had a roommate, we were pretty much the same size, and we both had very limited wardrobes. We were looking for work, so we would borrow clothes so we could put together a semi-professional looking outfit. But the rule was that you had to make sure that the roommate wasn't going to need that jacket or that, you know, whatever. And whatever you borrowed had to be returned clean. Some people are really fussy about their records or their CDs. I don't mind if you borrow my CDs, but you have to put them back in order because I've got them all organized. You can't just sort of leave them on the floor in front of my bookshelf. They have to be put back right exactly where you found it. I had a neighbor that used to borrow my lawnmower. I had an electric lawnmower, so he would borrow my lawnmower and to mow his lawn. Well, every time he borrowed it, the electric cord would come back shorter because he'd run over the cord. So, new rule, you can borrow my lawnmower anytime you want. I've left it outside the back basement door, but you have to use your own power cord. I'm not loaning my cord every time because it keeps coming back shorter because it's cut and I've got to splice it. Anyway, it's a big headache. So the new rule was you can borrow the lawnmower but not my power cord. So when it comes to personal possessions, you have a right to set some parameters around whether anybody else can use your stuff. And we're in a room with people with some really expensive tech equipment. And I don't imagine you're going to loan it out to just any old buddy that comes along. You have to either, you don't loan it out at all, or you have to be absolutely certain that they know what they're doing and they're going to treat your equipment with ultimate respect. They're looking at each other. So, you know, that kind of stuff is really important. The next area is ideology. Now, if we vote for different political parties, I can't say, you idiot, how can you vote for those criminals? That's a violation of your ideological perspective. What I can say is I don't choose to support the progressive conservative because I don't agree with their social policy. I choose to support this other party whose social policies I do agree with. So I'm only saying that we're different. I'm not saying you're stupid or wrong for having a different political orientation. I'm just saying, here are the reasons why we have a different perspective on political issues. And that's okay. We can have ideological differences as long as we discuss those differences in a respectful manner. The other issue, and I know that probably everybody in the room has heard this before, and this is an emotional boundary issue. Either your parents or somebody else's parents you've heard say, "Stop that crying or I'll give you something to cry about." Sound familiar?
Yeah.
Yeah. Nobody has a right to tell someone they're not supposed to feel something. That child has a right to cry. And you don't shut them down. You don't say, "Stop that crying or I'll give you something to cry about." You say, "Okay, what's going on? What are you upset about? Talk to me." Another one that parents say, some parents, is, "Don't you get angry with me." Kids have a right to their anger. When my nephews were little, they picked up on hitting from daycare, and I used to spend a lot of time visiting my sister and her wonderful children, one of whom I helped deliver. I think I shared that yesterday. They picked up on hitting from daycare, and they came home one day, and they were mad at me about something. I don't know what it was. That was like many decades ago. And I said, "I don't like being hit. It's okay if you're mad at me, but I don't want you, but don't hit me, because when you hit me, I just want to get away from you. So tell me what you're mad about, and I'll listen, and we'll talk about it." So they said, "Okay, I'm mad because whatever it was," and we talked it out, and we resolved it. So we didn't shut down their anger. We validated their anger, and we helped them learn how to express it more effectively. Well, I'll tell you something. If you're working with survivors of sexual abuse, a lot of your clients don't know how to express their anger, because anger was a weapon. That's how they kept people at a distance. And it's also how they hid their vulnerability. My vulnerability isn't going to show if I'm angry. If I'm raging at you and I'm screaming and I'm swearing and threatening, you're not going to see how vulnerable I am unless you're smart enough to pick up on what that anger is all about. So when clients are expressing inappropriately expressing their anger, the first thing you do is validate their anger. If you say to them, "Calm down, don't you get angry, you calm down," the anger is going to escalate. So what the first thing you say is, "You have every right to be angry. Just tell me what's going on. What's going on? What are you angry about?" And I think I shared this yesterday. I said to a client who was really angry, I said, "You have every right to be angry because what happened to you shouldn't have happened, and I'd be angry too if it happened to me. But I think there's a lot of pain there too." And he said, "You're right." And he connected with that pain and started crying. So I validated that anger, and I said, basically, there's more to it. There's something else going on. Let's look at that as well. So the best way to calm someone's anger is to validate their right to be angry. And right away, it's going to drop down a bit. It's not going to go away, because whatever is going on that they're angry about is still going to be there until you work on how do you resolve that in some kind of a functional way. But the best way to bring down the anger is to validate it and then work from there. So those are the 5 boundary areas. You cannot have an identity if you don't have a boundary. For example, I'm a non-smoker. So non-smoker is part of my identity. The boundary is you can't smoke in my office, my home, my car. If you're heterosexual, then sex with the opposite gender is outside the bounds. If you're homosexual, then sex... Did I say that right? Sex with the opposite... I said it wrong. Let me back up. If you're heterosexual, then sex with the same gender is out of bounds. If you're homosexual, then sex with the opposite gender is out of bounds. So your boundaries help define who you are. If you're vegetarian, that's part of your identity. The boundary is no meat in my food. If you're a member of the NDP party, then progressive conservative politics are outside the boundary. So your identity says who you are. So clients who've been so violated, they don't have a sense, they don't have an identity because they don't have boundaries. So the more you work with clients to identify where their boundaries are, and it's a lot of issues. What kind of food do you like? What kind of food don't you like? What kind of movies do you like going to? What kind of movies do you not like going to? I'm not interested in slasher movies, Friday the 13th, that kind of psycho, violent kind of stuff. It's like, I don't want that stuff in my head, thanks very much. I've gone to some movies where there's some violence in it, but it's not that psycho, twisted, weird kind of violence. It's just well, I don't really like violent films anyway, but sometimes I've seen movies where there's a bit of it and it's acceptable. I can deal with it. It's not going to give me nightmares. What kind of books do you like reading? Fiction, nonfiction, fantasy novels, romance novels. There's all kinds of books out there. So what kind of books do you like? What's your religious affiliation? Or religious/spiritual affiliation. So all of these issues are boundary issues. And the more you clarify where your boundaries are, the more clear you are as to who you are. So you can't really formulate an identity without boundaries. And it's an area to really work with a lot with survivors because their boundaries have been so violated that they really don't know where they're at. And they're not allowed to have emotional reactions. They're not allowed to speak openly about what's being done to them. So again, you really have to work with this. And where trust comes in, the criteria for deciding who you can trust is, do they respect your boundaries? If I say to a client, you can't smoke in my office, if they say, I'm really stressed out, I need my cigarette, and they light up, I can't trust that person because I've articulated my boundary and they're not respecting it. So I can't trust that person. But the first person I have to trust is myself. I have to say to them, you can't smoke in my office. If I don't say that, it's not their fault, it's my fault. And I remember years ago, people would smoke in my house and I just wish they didn't, but I didn't feel like I had a right to tell people they couldn't smoke. Well, there was a phrase I needed to add to that sentence. You know, you can't smoke in my environment. You can smoke all you want, but just not in my environment. So when I first started articulating that, it was really uncomfortable. I'd say, well, would it be okay if you didn't smoke in my house? And people were saying, oh yeah, no problem, and they didn't. I go, oh wow, that was a lot easier than I thought it would be. But a lot of times survivors don't know how to assert their boundaries. They're afraid they don't have a right because as a kid in an abusive environment, if they try to say, no, I don't want to, they would get punished. So kids are not allowed to have boundaries in a dysfunctional environment. And so the idea of expressing a boundary is extremely frightening to them because they can't imagine being able to express a boundary and have that being respected.
And I think that would be a good point to take our first morning break.
All right. See you in 10 minutes.